The first snowfall of the evening drifted past the lanterns outside Briarwood Court, soft enough to disguise the cold, but not the tension. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with gold, musicians lifting their bows, crystal trembling under gloved hands. It should have been a night of easy laughter, predictable dances, and the Duke's practiced indifference, until the great doors opened. A hush rippled outward, slow at first, then sudden as heads turned toward the entrance. A woman stood framed by the glow from the corridor behind her, pale, poised, almost unreal. Eveline Harborough. A name etched on a memorial stone. A woman buried in the minds of everyone present. And yet, she was breathing. Her hair, once bright as copper, now held deeper shadows. Her posture straight, though the weight she carried was visible in the set of her jaw. At her side, a small boy clutched her fingers, eyes wide with the hope of someone too young to understand danger. A glass slipped from someone's hand. The orchestra faltered, and the Duke Julian Ainsworth felt the ground he trusted shift beneath him. He'd mourned her once. He'd learned to move on. But now she had returned, and she wasn't alone. Hello. If stories of love that survives, impossible odds, speak to your soul, tales where courage is born from desperation and second chances emerge from winter's darkest nights, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Your support carries these stories across oceans to hearts that need them. And before we begin, tell us, would you return to a world that had already buried you? Snow settles over Briarwood Court as the Duke's annual Christmas ball begins, all glitter and whispered ambition. The last person anyone expects to see step through the ballroom doors is Lady Eveline Harborough, the woman whose name had appeared on a list of the dead nearly 4 winters ago. Her reappearance halts the music, freezes the Duke's breath, and upends the fragile order of the aristocratic world she disappeared from. Duke Julian Ainsworth, once her closest confidant and almost lover, is shaken not by her survival but by the child whose hand she holds, the grief in her eyes, and the mystery she refuses to speak aloud. The railway accident of 1844 had been catastrophic. 14 confirmed dead, dozens wounded, and several passengers never accounted for. Eveline's name fell into that final category, missing, presumed deceased. Her father, the aging Baron Harborough, had held a memorial service. Julian had attended, his grief concealed beneath aristocratic composure, while something inside him quietly shattered. But Eveline had survived. She crawled from the wreckage with injuries that stole her memory and left her wandering country roads until a dying gentleman named Thomas Ashfield found her. He took her to his estate, where physicians tended her wounds, while amnesia kept her past locked away. When memory finally returned months later, in fragments that felt like shards of glass, the world had already moved on. Her father was dead. Julian had inherited his brother's title and the responsibilities that came with it. And Thomas, weakened by consumption, had only months to live, and an infant son with no mother. Eveline made a choice. She married Thomas on his deathbed to give his son legal protection. She became a mother to little Edmund, not by blood but by fierce, deliberate love. And when Thomas died 3 months ago, his grasping relatives, led by his cousin Ambrose Meryton and the calculating Lady Portia Redwyke, immediately challenged the marriage, the will, and Eveline's right to raise the child. Her solicitor had been blunt. Without social standing, without proof of legitimacy, the courts would strip Edmund from her arms and hand him to relatives who saw only inheritance, not innocence. The only path forward was to reclaim her identity, to return to society, to face the man whose love she had abandoned without explanation. Now, as whispers turn to rumors and Julian walks toward her across the gleaming ballroom floor, Eveline understands that surviving the accident was merely the beginning. The real trial is about to start. Eveline did not move, not because she refused to, but because her legs had forgotten how to obey simple commands like step or breathe. Edmund's small hand gripped hers with strength that belied his 4 years. As though he sensed in that wordless way children understand danger, that everything hinged on this moment. The ballroom remained frozen, a tableau of shock wrapped in silk and candlelight. Eveline recognized faces in the crowd. Lady Ashworth, who had once dismissed her as a baronet's unremarkable daughter. Lord Pemberton, who had danced with her twice and forgotten her name both times. They stared now as if she were some curiosity dragged from the Thames, fascinating and grotesque in equal measure. And Julian Julian walked toward her with a measured pace that suggested control, while his green eyes betrayed something close to fury. He had changed. The softness she remembered had been carved away, replaced by sharp angles and the weight of a title he'd never wanted. His dark evening coat fit him like armor. His jaw was set in a line that promised no mercy. He stopped 3 paces away, close enough that she could see the muscle working in his temple, far enough that the distance felt deliberate. Lady Harborer. Her title in his mouth sounded like an indictment. Your Grace. The formality tasted like ashes. Silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Around them, the ballroom held its collective breath. Edmund tugged at her skirt. "Mama?" The word rippled through the crowd like a stone through still water. Eyes widened. Fans snapped open to hide gasping mouths. Julian's gaze dropped to the boy, and something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or pain, before the ducal mask settled back into place. "We cannot speak here," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Come with me." It wasn't a request. Eveline glanced at Edmund, whose brown eyes had grown enormous with uncertainty. She wanted to refuse, wanted to gather her son and flee back into the winter night. But Julian had already turned, expecting her to follow, and the crowd was watching, hungry for scandal. She had no choice. "Stay close to me, darling," she murmured to Edmund, and followed the Duke through a sea of staring faces. They crossed the ballroom, an endless journey beneath chandeliers and judgment, and stepped through a side door into a corridor lined with ancestral portraits. The music resumed behind them, muffled now, as Julian led them deeper into Briarwood Court. He stopped before a mahogany door, opened it without ceremony, and stood aside. Eveline entered what appeared to be a private study. Books climbed the walls. A fire burned low in the grate. The room smelled of leather and tobacco and masculine spaces where power lived. Julian closed the door. The click of the latch sounded final. For a long moment, no one spoke. Edmund pressed himself against Eveline's skirts, peeking out at the Duke with a child's honest wariness. "Sit," Julian said, gesturing to a chair before the fire. Eveline sat, arranging Edmund on her lap where she could feel his heartbeat against her ribs, fast, frightened, trusting her to keep him safe. Julian remained standing, pacing to the window and back, energy radiating from him in barely contained waves. 4 years, he said at last, the words emerging rough. 4 years, Eveline. Your name was on the list. The memorial service, I stood there and listened to the vicar speak of your virtues while your father wept. He stopped, hands curling into fists. I searched. For months, I searched. Every hospital, every physician, every damned village between here and York. Nothing, not a trace. I know, Eveline whispered. Do you? He turned on her, and the raw pain in his face made her flinch. Do you know what it does to a man, believing the woman he stopped, jaw working. And now you simply appear, alive, with a child who calls you Mama. Julian, where were you? The question cracked like a whip. What happened? Eveline drew a shaking breath. Edmund had gone very still in her arms, listening to adult words he couldn't fully understand, but feeling their weight nonetheless. The accident, she began, each word costing effort. I remember the train leaving the rails, the screaming, metal tearing, then nothing. I woke in a stranger's home, with no memory of who I was. Julian's expression didn't soften. And when your memory returned? By then, my father was dead, you were Duke, I was legally deceased. She forced herself to meet his gaze. I had married a dying man to protect his son from relatives who wanted him only for his inheritance. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush. His name? Julian asked, voice flat. Thomas Ashfield, a gentleman of modest means and generous heart. Her arms tightened around Edmund. He found me on the road, took me in, asked nothing in return. When he realized his illness was fatal, he asked me to marry him so Edmund would have legal protection. And you agreed? Yes. You chose to marry a stranger rather than send word to me. Each word fell like a stone. Rather than let me know you lived. Tears burned behind Eveline's eyes. I thought I believed it would be easier, that you had moved on. That dragging scandal to your door would only hurt you. Easier. Julian laughed, a bitter sound. You thought letting me grieve was easier? I was afraid. The admission burst from her before she could stop it. Afraid of what returning would mean. Afraid of the questions I couldn't answer. afraid of being the source of your ruin instead of—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Instead of what?" he pressed, moving closer. "Instead of the woman you once loved," she whispered. The words hung between them, raw and bleeding. Julian stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned away, bracing his hands on the mantelpiece as though he needed its support to remain upright. "Why are you here?" he asked finally, his back still to her. "The truth, Eveline." She stroked Edmund's hair with trembling fingers. "Thomas's relatives are challenging my guardianship. They claim the marriage was invalid, that I manipulated a dying man. They want his inheritance. My solicitor says without social standing, without proof of my identity and legitimacy, the courts will grant them custody. So you need me." He didn't turn around. "You need the Duke of Ainsworth to validate your existence." The assessment was accurate and devastatingly cold. "Yes," she said, because there was no point in lying. Julian was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Edmund's breathing had slowed, exhaustion pulling at him, despite the tension in the room. "Very well," Julian said at last, his voice empty of emotion. "You and the boy will stay here at Briarwood Court. Tomorrow we'll address the legal matters." He finally turned to face her, and the blankness in his expression was somehow worse than anger. "But understand this, Eveline. I'm doing this for the child, not for you." The words hit like a physical blow, but Eveline forced herself to nod. "I understand." "Do you?" He moved toward the door. 4 years of grief, Eveline. 4 years of believing you dead. I don't know if that's something I can forgive." He left without waiting for a response, the door closing behind him with quiet finality. Eveline sat in the sudden silence, holding Edmund as he finally surrendered to sleep. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent, useless things that changed nothing. She had survived the train wreck. She had survived amnesia and loss. She had survived Thomas's death and his relatives' cruelty. But sitting in Julian's study, feeling the weight of his absence like a wound, Eveline wondered if she would survive this, the look in his eyes when he'd said, "I don't know if that's something I can forgive." Outside, the Christmas ball continued. Music drifted faintly through the walls, elegant and distant. But here, in this room that smelled of Julian's cologne and broken promises, Eveline held a sleeping child and mourned for the second time the man she had loved. The first time, she had believed him lost to her by circumstance. This time, she had lost him by choice. And that, she was learning, hurt infinitely more. The Court of Chancery smelled of old wood and older prejudices, its high windows letting in pale winter light that did nothing to warm the stone walls. Eveline sat beside Julian's solicitor, Mr. Blackwood, with Edmund pressed against her side, his small hand clutching hers with desperate strength. Across the aisle, Ambrose Meryton and Lady Portia Redwyke sat in elegant judgment, their faces masks of false concern. The magistrate, Lord Justice Pemberton, was a grey man with grey eyes, who looked at Eveline as though she was something distasteful he'd found on his boot. "This court convenes to determine the matter of guardianship for the minor Edmund Ashfield," he intoned. "Lady Harborough, you stand accused of fraudulently obtaining guardianship through a marriage of convenience to a dying man. How do you answer?" "Not guilty, my lord," Eveline said, forcing her voice steady. "I married Thomas Ashfield to honour his dying wish that his son have a mother." Lady Portia's solicitor, a sharp-faced man named Grimsby, rose with theatrical slowness. "My lord, if I may, Lady Harborough's own history calls her credibility into question. She disappeared for 4 years, presumed dead, during which time she conveniently lost all memory of her identity. How fortunate that her memory returned only after securing marriage to a man of property. I suffered genuine amnesia from injuries sustained in a railway accident," Eveline replied, heat rising in her cheeks. "The physicians who treated me can attest." "Can they?" Grimsby interrupted smoothly. "Or will we hear testimony from physicians long dead, convenient graves, absolving convenient lies?" He turned to the magistrate. "My lord, we have witnesses who will testify that before her disappearance, Lady Harborough was fleeing an arranged marriage to Lord Carrington, a legal betrothal she abandoned out of willful disobedience." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Eveline felt the walls closing in, felt every eye dissecting her like something pinned to a board. Edmund whimpered, sensing her distress, and she gathered him closer. Julian stood abruptly. "My lord, if I may address the court." Lord Justice Pemberton frowned. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. So is allowing character assassination to masquerade as testimony," Julian said coldly. Lord Carrington's reputation is well known. 3 wives dead under suspicious circumstances. A man of violent temperament and crushing debts. Lady Harborough didn't flee duty, she fled for her life. The Duke's personal feelings cloud his judgment, Grimsby countered. It is known he was attached to Lady Harborough before her disappearance. His protection of her now suggests motives beyond altruism. My motives are transparent, Julian said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. I seek justice for a child who deserves better than to be used as a pawn in an inheritance dispute by relatives who showed him no affection until his father's death made him valuable. Speaking of the child, Grimsby said with false sympathy, turning toward Edmund. Perhaps young Edmund can tell us, does he even remember his real father? Or has Lady Harborough so thoroughly replaced his memory that the boy believes this pretense? Don't, Eveline said sharply, her arms tightening around Edmund. He's 4 years old. You will not use him. The court has a right to hear from the subject of these proceedings, Grimsby insisted, moving closer. Edmund, do you know these people want to take you to a lovely house in the country, with cousins to play with and proper tutors? Edmund buried his face in Eveline's shoulder. I want to stay with Mama, but she's not really your Mama, is she? Grimsby pressed. Your real Mama is in heaven. Enough! Julian's voice cracked like thunder. He was on his feet, crossing the space between them with such fury that 2 clerks rose in alarm. You will not torment a frightened child to score points in your vendetta. Your Grace, control yourself, Lord Justice Pemberton warned, but his tone had shifted. Something in Julian's rage had registered as righteous rather than reckless. Mr. Blackwood seized the moment. My lord, we have documentation. Thomas Ashfield's will, clearly stating his wishes. Letters written in his own hand expressing his trust in Lady Harborough. Testimony from his physician, confirming his mental clarity at the time of marriage. And most importantly, we have a child who has known no other mother, who thrives in her care, and who would be irreparably harmed by separation. The magistrate studied the documents for what felt like an eternity. The courtroom held its breath. Eveline felt Julian's presence behind her like a shield, solid and unwavering, and realized with sudden clarity that whatever the outcome, she was no longer fighting alone. This court finds, Lord Justice Pemberton said at last, insufficient evidence to support claims of fraud or incompetence. Guardianship of Edmund Ashfield shall remain with Lady Eveline Harborough, subject to periodic review. He fixed Ambrose and Lady Portia with a stern look. Further harassment of this nature will be viewed most unfavorably. The gavel fell. Eveline couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only hold Edmund as the boy's tears soaked into her dress, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of a child who understood enough to know he was safe. Julian's hand found her shoulder, warm and steady. It's over, he said quietly. You won. But looking up at him, seeing the fierce protectiveness still burning in his eyes, Eveline understood that the real victory wasn't the magistrate's ruling. It was this, being seen, being defended, being worth fighting for. They returned to Briarwood Court in silence, Edmund asleep between them in the carriage, exhausted from the day's ordeal. Snow had begun to fall again, transforming London's grey streets into something almost beautiful. Eveline watched the flakes drift past the window and felt the weight of the past 4 years finally begin to lift. Julian had fought for her, not out of duty or pity, but with the kind of fury that came from something deeper, something she was terrified to name in case she was wrong. When they arrived, Julian carried Edmund upstairs while Eveline followed, and together they settled the boy into bed. Edmund stirred only once, mumbling, "Mama," before sinking back into sleep, and Eveline smoothed his hair with fingers that trembled. "He's safe now," Julian said softly from the doorway. "Because of you." She turned to face him, tears threatening. "Blackwood handled everything, kept your distance, protected your reputation. Instead, you stood before the entire court and..." Her voice broke. "Why, Julian? Why did you fight for me like that?" He was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes searching hers in the dim light. "Do you really not know?" "I know what I hope," she whispered, "but I'm afraid to believe it." Julian crossed the room slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. When he stood before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, he lifted his hand and gently traced the line of her jaw. "4 years ago," he said quietly, "I was going to ask you to marry me. I had the ring commissioned. I'd spoken to your father. I was waiting for the right moment and then you were gone, and I thought I'd lost my chance forever." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. catching a tear. When you walked back into that ballroom, alive, I was so angry. Angry that you'd survived and hadn't told me. Angry that you'd chosen someone else. Angry that I'd grieved you when you were out there breathing, living, building a life without me. Julian, let me finish, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I told myself I was helping you for Edmund's sake, that I could keep my distance, could protect you without letting you back into my heart. But watching Grimsby try to destroy you today, hearing them question your honor, seeing Edmund's fear, he stopped, jaw tightening. I realized I never stopped loving you, Eveline, not for a single day. Not when I thought you were dead, not when I learned you'd married another man, not even when I was furious with you for staying away. Eveline's breath caught in her throat. You still love me? I never stopped, he said simply. I don't know if I can. She reached up, her hand covering his where it rested against her face. I loved Thomas, she said, needing him to understand. Not the way I loved you, but genuinely. He gave me safety when I had nothing. He gave me purpose. He gave me Edmund. I won't apologize for that marriage, Julian. It saved me in ways you'll never fully understand. I'm not asking you to apologize, Julian said. I'm asking you to trust that there's room in your life for both truths, that you can honor what Thomas gave you while still, he paused, vulnerability flickering across his face, while still choosing me, if you want to. If I want to. She gave a shaky laugh. I've wanted nothing else since the moment I walked into that ballroom and saw you standing there. I've wanted to explain, to apologize, to beg you to look at me the way you used to, like I was something precious instead of something broken. You were never broken, Julian said fiercely. You were surviving. There's nothing shameful in that. Then why do I feel like I failed you? The words burst out before she could stop them. Why do I feel like I should have found a way to come back sooner, to trust you with the truth instead of hiding behind fear? Because you're human, he said, pulling her closer. Because trauma doesn't follow logical rules. Because you did the best you could with impossible choices, and that's all anyone can ever do. He rested his forehead against hers. I'm not angry anymore, Eveline. I'm just grateful you're here, that you're alive, that I have a chance to say what I should have said 4 years ago. What's that? She whispered. I love you, he said, the words simple and devastating. I want to marry you, not because you need protection, or because Edmund needs a father, though God knows I'd be honored to be both, but because I love you, Eveline Harborough, every stubborn, courageous, terrified part of you, and if you'll have me, I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face anything alone again. The tears came in earnest then, and Eveline let them fall. Yes, she said through her sobs. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I love you. Yes to all of it. Julian kissed her then, soft and reverent, like a man who'd been granted a second chance at something sacred. And in the quiet room where Edmund slept, safe and loved, Eveline finally allowed herself to believe in futures built from honesty instead of fear. Spring came early to Briarwood Court that year, as though even the weather understood that the time for cold and darkness had passed. The wedding was small, attended only by close friends and the staff who had watched the story unfold from its dark beginning to its unexpected grace. Edmund served as ring-bearer with solemn pride, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the boy cheered loud enough to make the congregation laugh. But it was the moment after, when Julian knelt to Edmund's level and said, I promise to take care of both of you, always, that made Eveline understand the true weight of what they'd built. Not just a marriage, but a family chosen, fought for, and fiercely protected. They honeymooned quietly at Briarwood Court, spending days walking the grounds with Edmund racing ahead and evenings by the fire planning futures that no longer felt fragile. Julian began the process of formally adopting Edmund, ensuring that no Meriton or Redwyke could ever again threaten the boy's security. Eveline worked with solicitors to establish a trust in Edmund's name, built from what remained of Thomas's estate and augmented by Julian's own resources. He'll never want for anything, Julian said one evening reviewing the documents. He already doesn't, Eveline replied, watching Edmund build castles from wooden blocks. He has what Thomas wanted most for him, love. Julian set the papers aside and pulled her into his arms. As do you. As do I, she agreed, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. The world, predictably, had opinions. Some of society whispered about the scandal of it all, a duke marrying a woman who'd returned from the dead with a ready-made family. Others found it romantic, proof that true love could survive anything, even grief and time and impossible choices. Eveline learned to ignore both camps, focusing instead on the life they were building day by small day. Edmund thrived. He called Julian Papa within 3 months and asked innocent questions about having a brother or sister that made Eveline blush and Julian laugh. They hired tutors who understood that a child who'd lost one father deserved gentleness as well as education. They made Briarwood Court into a home rather than a showpiece. And on the anniversary of the night Eveline had walked back through those ballroom doors, Julian commissioned a portrait of the three of them, Eveline in blue silk, Edmund between them with his hand in hers, and Julian standing with his hand on her shoulder. No titles included, just their names and the date. "So we never forget," he said when it was hung in the gallery. "How far we've come." Eveline studied the painting, this family they'd assembled from wreckage and will. "Do you have regrets?" she asked quietly. "About taking us on? About the scandal?" Julian turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her arms. "My only regret is the time we lost. Everything else, the gossip, the legal battles, the uncertainty. I'd do it all again without hesitation if it meant ending up here, with you, with Edmund, with this life we've made. Even when Edmund puts frogs in your boots? Even then," he said solemnly, though his eyes danced. "Though I reserve the right to retaliate with strategic tickling." She laughed, and the sound felt like freedom light and unguarded and completely genuine. 4 years ago, she'd thought joy was something she'd forfeited when she climbed aboard that doomed train. She'd believed survival meant settling for less, for safety without love, for protection without passion. But standing in Briarwood Court with Julian's arms around her and Edmund's laughter echoing through the halls, Eveline understood that she'd been wrong. Survival wasn't about settling. It was about fighting for the life you deserved, even when the world insisted you should accept less. It was about trusting that some people would fight alongside you, not because they had to, but because they chose to. "Thank you," she whispered against Julian's chest. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For fighting when I couldn't. For loving me, even when I made it difficult." He kissed the top of her head. "Loving you has never been difficult, Eveline. Letting you go was the only hard part, and I'll never have to do that again." Edmund crashed into them then, demanding they come see the robin's nest he'd found in the garden, and they let him tug them toward the door. Outside, the grounds of Briarwood Court stretched green and gold in the early summer sun, and somewhere in the distance, the future waited, uncertain perhaps, but no longer frightening. Because Eveline had learned the most important truth of all. She was no longer alone. She had Edmund, brave and bright and completely hers. She had Julian, who'd proven that some kinds of love were patient enough to wait through death itself. And she had herself, the woman who'd survived a train wreck, amnesia, loss, and legal battles, and emerged not broken but forged into something stronger. The dead woman who'd walked into that Christmas ball was truly gone now. In her place stood someone new. Eveline Ainsworth, Duchess of Briarwood Court, mother to Edmund, wife to Julian, and most importantly, a woman who'd chosen her own fate and won. The future, for the first time in 4 long years, looked absolutely beautiful. You've watched Eveline fight for everything. You've seen Julian refuse to give up. Now I need you to do one simple thing. Subscribe. If this story moved you and you don't subscribe, you're telling me it wasn't worth your time. Prove me wrong. Hit that button. Comment, "Worth it," if you stayed until the end. That's all I'm asking. Don't be the person who watches for free and gives nothing back. Thank you for journeying with us through Eveline and Julian's story, from the moment she stepped back from the dead into that Christmas ballroom, through every revelation and battle, to this hard-won peace. Their story reminds us that love isn't always easy, but it's always worth fighting for. Thank you for caring about these characters as much as we do. And remember, your subscription, your like, your comment, they're not just numbers. They're what keeps these stories alive. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you.